Okay, so we're going to get started again. First, my name is Ron Wertz. I'm Regional Outreach Director here at the Minneapolis Federal Reserve Bank, and I will be the moderator for this first panel. But before we get into our last portions of the conference, the three panels, I wanted to give you a little bit of an overview of how we've structured the rest of the conference and these particular panels. As Neil alluded to in his welcoming remarks, we've built in a lot of content to this conference. But we also wanted to stress the need for dialogue and conversation. And for that reason, the content that we've planned is more appetizer than entree. So it's enough to whet your appetite on the information, but probably not enough to satisfy it. There's lots of information clearly in the room just listening to the conversation with the senator. A lot of people that have a lot of knowledge on immigration. We're going to whet your appetites with data now, but we really wanted to do it to lead into a conversation. So we're going to give short presentations that are timed, and then we're going to move to a Q&A. So much like last time, get your hands up. We'll find you with microphones for questions. In the interest of saving time, because these are relatively short, we're also going to do fairly short introductions. And FYI, most of the presenters will have PowerPoints. Those will be posted online for your perusal after the conference. With that, I'd like to introduce our first speaker, Ryan Allen, who is an Associate Professor of Community and Economic Development at the Humphrey School of Public Affairs at the University of Minnesota. Please welcome Ryan.
Good morning. How are you all? It's good to see you here today. Thank you to the organizers for the opportunity to be here. Before I begin my remarks, you see the title here. I want to speak broadly about immigrants in Minnesota's workforce. When we talk about immigration, we talk about immigration in relation to the economy. It can be tempting to think really abstractly about supply and demand and people as cogs in the wheel of production. And that's an important conversation to have, and you'll see me have it in just a moment. But I think it's also important to recognize that these are people. These are residents. These are our neighbors. These are our people in our congregations, in our synagogues, in our mosques. And it's important to not lose sight of that important part. With that said, let me give you a presentation of what I want to do today based on four kind of large points. The first is I'm going to provide some data to support all of these assertions. Our population in this state is going to grow slowly in the future. That's almost certain at this point. And if you look closely at what anticipated growth we have, a lot of that future population growth is going to be because of immigrants. I'm going to talk a little bit about how important immigrants currently are to Minnesota's labor force and how I think they'll be even more important in the future. And then I'm going to conclude with some thoughts about how we should be thinking about immigration policy, how we should be thinking about that as a state here in Minnesota. So these are data that largely come from the State Demographer's Office, so I want to give credit to her. They also come from DEED, our Department of Employment and Economic Development, and a couple of other sources, mostly census data. This is a map of, obviously, Minnesota by county. This indicates the projected population growth through the year 2045, right? So looking at between 2015 and 2045, where do we anticipate most of the growth in the state in terms of our population? And you can see that large stripe going from the north to the northwestern corner to the southeastern corner, encompassing certainly the metropolitan area of the Twin Cities, and so on. You can see in the Iron Range, right, the northeastern part of the state, the slowest, in fact, negative population growth that's anticipated in that area of the state, and in the far western side of the state, much slower population growth as well. This projection is predicted to slow considerably after the year 2030. For reasons that I'll get into in just a moment. But when we ask demographers about what this population growth is going to look like and why it's slowing down, it's important to think about two components, broad components of population change. One of those demographers called natural change. The way they define natural change is the number of births in any given year minus the number of deaths in a particular state. Sorry, I've always thought that we're here at the Federal Reserve Bank, so I can make this joke. Economists always get a bad rap of being the dismal scientists, right? I think demographers definitely take the cake, though. It's like every year you get a year older, and then eventually the inevitable happens. So Mike, as a card-carrying economist, can appreciate that. The natural change, births minus deaths. So you can see that in the blue line pictured on this chart. For your reference, let me point out the zero line. Right? Here's zero. So if we look at this chart, you can see that the anticipated natural change through the year, through the mid-2040s, is downward sloping. We can anticipate an increasing number of deaths compared to births, and in fact, around the year 2040, we get to that zero mark. Right? And after that, there'll be more deaths than births in the state of Minnesota. This is what the state demographer is projecting. On the other hand, we have this red line, the net migration line. And this is not thinking about domestic versus international migrants to the state, but who's moving in versus who is moving out. And you can see kind of a steady state around 10,000 per year for the foreseeable future. And then, for reasons that I'm sure the state demographer could go into more depth on, a gradual climbing until it plateaus around 25,000. So when we put these numbers together, we're still going to have positive population growth, the state demographer tells us. But the natural change is sobering, right? That's just a function of the demography of our state. Let's look more deeply into that migration story, however. So if we separate migration from folks who are born in the United States and what's their net migration versus those who are born outside the United States and what's their net migration to our state, an interesting pattern emerges. Between the early 90s through the beginning of the 21st century, there was positive net migration for both international migrants and domestic migrants coming to the state of Minnesota. And then in 2002, the domestic migration reversed, right? And there were more people who were born in the United States that were leaving the state of Minnesota than were coming. On the other hand, the international migrants remained positive and in fact increased to such an extent that they offset and in fact produced more migrants coming to the state than we were losing from the domestic side. So we don't know what will happen in the future, but if the last 10 years or so is any guess, it helps us guess about this. One of the takeaways from this chart is that for the foreseeable future, international immigration is going to be an important component of migration to the state of Minnesota. Right? In fact, if the past is any guide, it's going to offset people who are leaving the state. And when you combine this with that predicted natural change, which is heading down, a lot of the population growth we can anticipate, in fact, I would say a disproportionate share of the population growth we can anticipate in this state is going to be due to immigration. A little history. When I travel around the state, part of my work is with Minnesota Extension. When I talk to people around the state, sometimes you hear the comments, and we've really never seen this kind of immigration to the state of Minnesota that we're experiencing here today. And that's a really short historical memory. What I'm presenting in this chart are data that go back from 1850 through 2010 from the Census Bureau, which indicate the proportion of Minnesota's population that's foreign-born. Right, that's the red dotted line, in comparison to the blue line, which is the Midwest overall, and the solid gray line, which is the United States overall. So you can see in the latter half of the 19th century, in fact, there were very few states other than Minnesota that had a higher proportion of their population that was foreign-born. During this period, upwards of a third of the state of Minnesota was foreign-born. And I think that's a historical fact that many times people either don't realize or certainly don't recognize the magnitude, right? This was a really important component of our population in the state. Obviously, you see a dramatic decline. Things changed in the state of Minnesota such that now we're lagging considerably the United States overall, and we're right in line with the rest of the Midwest in terms of what proportion of our population is foreign-born, to the tune of about 8% in this state compared to 13.5% to 14% nationally. So at one time, we led the United States, just about, And today we lag considerably the United States in terms of the proportion of our state's population that's foreign-born. What can we anticipate for the future? Now, I have to take credit for these numbers. Susan Brower, our state demographer, doesn't have, has not yet calculated her projected growth in immigration in our state, and neither is that calculated by the Census Bureau. For the United States, what the Census Bureau tells us is that roughly today about 44 million, 43 million immigrants in our nation. They anticipate by 2060 that will grow to almost 80 million. That will take us from 13.5% to closer to 19% of our population in the United States overall foreign-born. In Minnesota, and again, these are my calculations, we're going to move from about 430,000 today to closer to 870, maybe 900,000 by the year 2060, shifting us from about 8% of our population to about 13%. Now, before we start oohing and awing over how big of an increase that is for our state, it's important to keep in mind that if this projection is correct, that we'll be at 13%, which is currently less than the United States overall. So we're still going to lag considerably the United States. At least that's what I anticipate. What about the labor force, right? What do immigrants mean for Minnesota's labor force? This is looking over the last 10 or so years, and there's a couple of things to point out in this chart. The blue bar graph here corresponds to the left-hand side. This is the number of immigrants that are currently in Minnesota's labor force. Right? So you can see, without a doubt, a positive upward trend. Right? Immigrants are becoming a larger number of workers in the state of Minnesota. Right? That's unambiguous. The red line corresponds to the right-hand vertical axis. This is the proportion of our state's workforce that's foreign-born. That also is unambiguously positive. So in the last 10 years or so, we've moved from about 7.5% of our labor force that's foreign-born to about 10.5%. A significant increase, I think, in a relatively short amount of time. Immigrants currently are important to our labor force. I think that's an easy thing to see. We also should anticipate they will be increasingly important to our labor force in the future. Now, what about the kinds of skills that are currently residing in our immigrant population? Well, it's important to understand that how we define skills is oftentimes far from clear, but one of the favorite ways that economists have to define skill is educational attainment. So if we look at those who have less than a high school degree, the blue bar represents the proportion of native-born workers with less than a high school degree. The red indicates the proportion of foreign-born workers with less of a high school degree. So you can see a really outsized, disproportionate proportion. About a quarter of our immigrants in Minnesota lack a high school degree. At the same time, you can also see at the high end of the educational spectrum, right, that immigrants in the state of Minnesota are much more likely than the native-born population to have a graduate or professional degree. Right? So there's this kind of bifurcated aspect to the labor force when it comes to immigration. Let me kind of start to cut to the heart of the matter. President Kashkali said that an important component of economic growth is what's happening with our labor force and what's happening with our population. Here are the projected numbers that the state demographer has for how she anticipates our labor force will grow into the future. Some of these are actual data, so the 60s, 70s, 80s, 90s, and through the first decade of the 21st century, those are actual numbers. On an average annual basis, you can see how we've declined, right? Moving from about a high watermark of 2.5% average annual growth, going down to less than 1% until finally today it's about 0.5% per year that our labor force grows. Anemic by historical standards, in recent history at least. We do not anticipate that's going to increase. Right? We're going to be under 0.5% for the foreseeable future. To the extent that that has an important effect on our economic growth, we are not going to be able to rely, the state demographer tells us, on robust growth in our labor force to buoy our economic growth into the future. That should be a cause for some concern. We already know about the job vacancies, but let me highlight this for you. This is looking at job vacancies in Minnesota by region of the state. looking first as a percentage of the 2005 level of vacancy on the left-hand side of the chart. On the right-hand side, vacancies as a percent of total employment. No matter how you measure it, job vacancies are going up, right? There simply aren't enough workers to fulfill the number of jobs that are being demanded or are available to workers in the Minnesota economy, and that's true for every region of the state. We can anticipate, these numbers come from DEED, that in fact, until the next recession comes, if you know when that's going to be, please let me know. This kind of disparity between the amount of jobs available and the number of workers available to work in those jobs is going to likely increase. It's a really simple takeaway, but it's a sobering one. So what can we do to shrink the gap? And this is, I'll start to conclude, Ron. There are some key groups of immigrants in our labor force currently where there's a significant disparity in labor force participation between men and women. So one of the things we can do is to think about policies that would make that more equal, right? What would make it more attractive, in particular for women from the different immigrant groups I've listed here, to enter the workforce? That's one way we could start to shrink that gap, but it's not going to be sufficient. The numbers don't get us there. To that end, migration is going to be increasingly important, right? Just from an economic perspective. Like, let's put politics aside for just a moment and think about what this means for our economy. The state demographer tells us if we want to maintain a 0.5% annual growth in our labor force, we're going to have 4.5 times the anticipated number of migrants coming to the state of Minnesota by 2045 than we currently anticipate will be here. It's going to be incumbent upon us to consider how to make that happen. So how can we, right? And I invite a wider discussion during the Q&A. Certainly paying attention to the economic fundamentals of the state, which I think are resoundingly strong, but also understanding what kind of disparities currently exist in our state. How do we shrink those disparities for economic outcomes? We have to think much more aggressively and I think more holistically about how we think about welcoming immigrants to this state, because I believe that we're going to be increasingly competing with other states for a stagnant, if not shrinking, pool of immigrants if current federal policy is any guide here. I will stop there, although I would invite questions about my thoughts about the anticipated immigrant stream to the U.S. in the current climate. Thanks very much for your attention.
Thank you very much, Ryan. Our second speaker is Mike Allgrunn, who is a professor and economics chair at the Beacom School of Business, University of South Dakota. Please welcome Mike.
Thank you. All right. So Senator Johnson mentioned briefly college. Can you hear me? I don't know if I need to lean in. I'm good? All right. Mentioned that college costs were increasing, and I just wanted to make a quick pitch. University of South Dakota is very affordable, and I hear the economics department is phenomenal. So just a quick pitch there. I think I just earned my per diem. All right. So I was asked to speak a little bit more on something very different than Minnesota, and certainly different than the more urban setting here. And so I'm going to try to talk a little bit about immigration and rural issues. That's not the easiest data to find. I'm going to talk about South Dakota in general, which is mostly a rural state, and talk about our labor market situation, which is very similar to the other states in the district, particularly Montana and North Dakota. North Dakota has some unique issues of its own that Dr. Flynn will talk about later. But I do think there are some similarities here. So even if you are from Minneapolis and mostly interested in that, I do hope sort of thinking about how immigration and labor force issues affect the more rural parts of the state will also be interesting to you. All right, so I'm going to talk about, I think that's good enough. All right, President Kashkari mentioned economic growth basically comes from two sources, and he was correct. Productivity, right? Enhancements of how much we can get out of our inputs, or we need more inputs, higher population growth, right? And if we're thinking particularly about living standards, it's a very similar idea. It's not exactly the same. Yes, productivity is one of the things we want to think about. If we want more stuff per person, we need to be able to produce more stuff per person, but also we need more people working out of that population. So we need the population to grow, but we also need it to be participating in that productive process. So we need employment population ratio in some sense to increase if we want to see an increase in living standards in addition to our economic growth. So in South Dakota and through most of the district, we see really, really tight labor markets, much tighter throughout the Midwest than we see in the rest of the state. Right now we have really low unemployment rates, 3% in South Dakota. That's not too far off from what you see in most of the other states. Our labor force participation rates, now we are currently down a little bit from the previous year, but those are still very, very high. So throughout the region, you see very, very high labor force participation rates. What that means is of the people we have that are potentially available for work, basically 16 and over, non-institutionalized, a lot of them are choosing to be part of the labor force. Either they're looking for work or they've found work. And this is having a really high labor participation rate, of course, is really good for the economy. On the other hand, it means there's not a whole lot of room for growth when we're trying to look at expanding jobs and that sort of thing. We're sort of, as Professor Allen mentioned, sort of competing for the same group of workers to try to fill in all of those gaps. For us personally, we've seen a lot of growth. Now, 1.5% growth, which seems good to us. It's only 6,300 jobs, which maybe isn't a lot compared to Minnesota. But I do think it's a positive thing. We're seeing lots of growth in construction. Finance is a big one for us. It actually is down a little bit. And some mixed growth in some various industries. But one thing that's dominated our public discourse is technical school training. So one thing that we really are concerned about, I think both on a national level and on a local level, is manufacturing, healthcare. Those are two places that we're seeing a lot of growth in job openings, but not a lot of uptake in terms of people taking those jobs. Let's see, I think I'm one graph ahead of myself. This is just looking at, so we have years across the bottom. By the way, I should have mentioned my sources at the start. Bureau of Labor Statistics, a lot of these graphs are also coming from Dr. Ralph Brown, part of the South Dakota Council of Economic Advisors. This one here, we're going to look at non-farm employment. The red line is South Dakota, which again is sort of my proxy for this group for a more rural state or the more rural parts of Minnesota. And you can see this is on a logarithmic scale, so the line there, if you look at the slope, that's the growth rate. And South Dakota was not as affected as most of the district was not by that recession, but has also not grown quite as quickly coming out of it. Still, though, looks pretty good. What I was hoping to talk a little bit more about, and this is my argument that South Dakota is somewhat of a proxy. So here I see our two biggest cities, Sioux Falls, which is about a third of our population in South Dakota, is the green line there. And of course, you see really strong growth in employment. Rapid City is our second biggest city, although it's far smaller. And then South Dakota as a whole is the red line. So if you thought about that red line, subtract out that green line, we look a little bit more in the rural area, more like the United States in general. One really strong point of growth, which I think dovetails with the immigration issue here, is that we've seen, although our manufacturing sector took a hit just like everywhere, it's been growing at a very strong rate, and especially in the last few years, we've seen a lot of increases in manufacturing in South Dakota. Some of that is value-added agriculture type manufacturing, but a lot of it is not. So this is more of the traditional kinds of things. We're seeing growth in wind turbines and the casings for those and that sort of thing. Lots of manufacturing that's going well. And the value-added ag, of course, is also important. So this is important. However, and I believe this is where we go, the question is who's going to take these jobs? So most, I think, native-born South Dakotans and people in those rural places are not looking to stay on the farm. They're not looking to work at the local value-added ag sort of place. That's not a job that they see themselves doing. They've sort of grown up with the idea that they need to go to college and they need to get some other sort of job. And so that's a difficulty. We also have very slow population growth. Everything that Dr. Allen said is certainly true in South Dakota as well. I suspect there's no variation there among in our district, that we're just going to see slow population growth, and the only place we're going to see growth is in migration. And we are seeing in South Dakota for the first time last year, we saw positive net migration, which was a big boon for us. But this technical training is a concern. Now, what is our current state of immigration? Because I think it's very clear that immigration has to play a role in this. Right now, only 3.6% of our population is foreign-born. That's well below Minnesota's was 8% and the national 14%. However, that has been increasing if you take sort of a long 20-year view of this, 25 years, right? That's a big increase. Most of the foreign-born, say in 1990, would have been from Asia, countries in Asia. And what we've seen since then is a big increase, especially Latin America, Central America, and then also Africa are two big places where we've seen a lot of growth of immigration into South Dakota. 38% of them are naturalized, 74% by their own account speak English well or very well, and I think that's generally true with the experience I have with people is that they do feel like they are a small proportion of our population, but they also seem pretty well integrated in the sense of they seem to be part of the communities, they seem to get along well with the native South Dakotans, and this is maybe contrary to some stereotypes. I think South Dakota and most of the Midwest is a very welcoming atmosphere for immigrants, and that most people are happy to have these people as neighborhood, as their neighbors and coworkers. The immigration of our current immigration group, it looks a lot like the graph that we saw from Dr. Allen. Again, immigrants are overrepresented in the less than high school group and in the college group. The first column is the immigration education levels, and in parentheses is the corresponding native born. So again, we're seeing, we don't see quite in college, but that's sort of where they look more like us. So there's at least potential here for this to fill some of our job vacancies. Most common industries where we see immigrants working, manufacturing and healthcare are definitely the top ones. Manufacturing, it's 12.8% of our manufacturing workforce is foreign-born, and that's compared to, again, that 3.8% of our population is foreign-born. And so what we're seeing is a lot of these workers are coming here for manufacturing. And now a lot of that is the most common place there, and I don't have a breakdown on this, but my anecdotal feeling is that most of this is in value-added agriculture. So if you look at the agricultural manufacturing in South Dakota, it's often very, very commonly it's an immigrant population that is manning those. Healthcare, same thing, much smaller portion there of that workforce. They're a large portion of our transportation as well. Oh my, that went much faster than I thought. Not faster than you thought, but here we go. All right, so I guess, actually I'm on my summary slide here, so maybe it's not so bad. It's pretty clear to me that immigration is essential to our continued job growth. I mean, it's that same story throughout the district that we're not going to see the growth in population. I mean, I try to, I talk to my students about this and I say, look, the only way to grow the economy is to grow the population. And so if you guys aren't gonna have more kids, that's not all we're gonna do. One student once volunteered if I could have the lecture off to go and work on that. And I said yes, but no one left. But I mean, I don't think we're gonna see a change there. So we really do need to see an increase in immigration. Nationally, as Ryan said, it's really unlikely that if that dries up, right, we really can't see a way to make this happen, right? This could become a really severe structural problem for our labor force if we cannot bring in the workers that we need to see continued economic growth. Rising wages, and again, I believe the President mentioned this, that there is a reluctance in a lot of rural areas to raise wages. So this sort of picture you have of someone who owns the local factory and says, well, this used to be a really good wage, and I can't understand why I can't get anybody to work at this wage, and he's right. But one solution to a shortage is to pay more in wages, right? And only now are we finally starting to hear people say, well, I raised the wage and suddenly there were workers. And imagine that. It's like a supply and a demand, and they meet. But we are starting to see rising wages. Now, some of that might be inflation, but if that encourages more people to take up these jobs, that could be really great. I also want to comment real briefly. So I think a lot of the national discussion on immigration views immigration as a substitute for domestic workers. And there's some truth to that, right? I mean, is certainly the case that if new workers come in from another country or from another state, they are competing with existing workers. There is a lot of evidence that says the people that new immigrants compete with the most are other recent immigrants, right? And that the effect on wages is actually not that great. And the other important aspect of this is they are also a complement to our existing workforce, right? If you have more immigrant workers, then there's more jobs to be had, right? It's a growing pie. You can think of maybe in a manufacturing plant, if you have a lot of sort of line workers that are immigrants, right, that allows you to have more maybe managers of those line workers that maybe aren't. And so those workers actually see an enhancement in their wages when we allow more immigration. So immigration can have a positive effect on existing workers, not just a negative one. And certainly has a positive effect on the economy as a whole. In training programs, I think that is something that we discuss a lot in South Dakota that we've been trying to get as we see our manufacturing grow, not being able to get local people to do that. So one thing I haven't seen a whole lot of is connecting the training programs with the immigration, right? So if we had, say, a refugee population, could we put them in touch with training programs? Is there some way we can make that happen faster to, if Native workers don't want to do this, right, then maybe we could have some of these immigration, have immigration be a solution for this. And I guess that's about all I have, and I'm about out of time, so I guess we'll go to questions.
Thank you, Mike. So as we did with Senator Johnson's sessions, there'll be a few microphones that are for your questions. I'll ask the first one, and then I'll keep asking questions until I hopefully see some hands. So I'm curious, Mike and Ryan, first, thank you very much for your presentations, really interesting. Both of you mentioned the education piece with essentially what you described as kind of a bifurcated situation with immigrants related to the Native population. I'm wondering if you can if you know where the trend is in that. Are we going to see more leveling out, especially of the under high school education, or is that growing? Can you tell us what the trend is regarding the education levels of immigrant populations?
So my understanding of the trend, Ron, is that that we're actually seeing an increase in the educational attainment of immigrants who are coming in. That's true for the family reunification immigrants who are coming in. It's certainly true from the diversity lottery that Senator Johnson mentioned earlier. So there's an overall trend and an increase in educational attainment and into that kind of the middle ground of the educational attainment distribution. I think I don't believe that bifurcation is going to erode immediately, right? I mean, they're still on either end of the educational spectrum. That's where most immigrants tend to be. But the trend, as I understand it, is an increase in educational attainment.
Yeah, I think that's about right. I mean, the model you sort of think of for why does someone immigrate, it's because they think there's a high expected benefit from doing so. And the two groups that sort of stand out as thinking there could be a high benefit is either low educated or high educated, right? I mean, those are sort of the two groups where you really could see a big difference in if I go to the United States, what my potential gains are. And so I think that's why we see that. As far as the trend, I suspect Ryan's correct, but I don't know.
But one other thing to add, if I can, sure. Ron, one of the things I think that we oftentimes lose sight of, in fact, when we think about immigrants, is that there's a really strong positive self-selection that happens with those who choose to move. These are not, by and large, kind of a cross-section of the country of origin. They're, in fact, usually tend to be kind of those who are upwardly mobile. And the other thing that I would mention about this, and actually in your packet, I think there's an op-ed from the president of the Fed here in Minneapolis who talks about immigration as a free lunch. And so from an economics perspective, if you could imagine having a trained workforce coming in that you didn't actually have to pay for their training, that's a pretty good deal, right, in relation to educational attainment, in particular to your question.
Great. Questions?
My name is Tom Camp. I'm an independent director. My question has to do with the comments that have been made about the tightness in the labor market. Specifically, have you guys studied the level of elasticity that exists in the labor market? And specifically, if we had a 1% rise in wages, what increase in labor force participation would we see?
It's a great question. I do not have that number. I wish I had that number. My suspicion is that it's probably not as elastic as we would hope. That some of this is going to take, I mean, at 1%, 2%, that might not be enough. Now, does it get more elastic as we get higher up? I think certainly. But my sense is at least in South Dakota, it's not just a wage discussion. It's also a sort of an expectations discussion about what kind of job do you see yourself taking and what kind of job would you be willing to take. And there's at least some segment of our population that would rather just not be in the workforce rather than take some of the available jobs. You have something more educated to say, I hope.
I'm not a card-carrying economist, so I'm going to plead ignorance on the elasticity question. I don't have that number either. But I think it's instructive to think about how much would the wage growth have to be for someone to take a job on a dairy, right? As an example, right? And if that elasticity is low enough, At what point does the dairy stop working, right? Because they can't be competitive in the milk industry anymore. I mean, those are real questions I think that we have to grapple with. And so I take Senator Johnson's point and the kind of larger economics lens on this really quite seriously. Yes, if you increase wages, people will come out. There's a reservation wage, people will enter. At what point do you price yourself out of competition, though? That's another question that I don't think we oftentimes grapple with.
That's a great point.
Sure.
Sorry, I just wanted to follow up on that. In Sioux Falls, for example, we have seen rising wages before we saw it in the rest of the state, and we did see an uptake in a pretty strong uptake. And so now I haven't turned that into an elasticity, but at least there we saw that there was some responsiveness to those higher wages. Whether that will happen in the rural parts of the state, that I'm unclear about.
Okay, question over here, gentlemen.
My name's Peter Merrill. I'm a recent domestic in-migrant to Minnesota. A question for Ryan. You showed steady domestic net out-migration since year 2000. What reasons would you give for that?
It's a great question. It's one that's on everyone's mind. So certainly a long-term trend is younger people in the state who are going out of state for college, right, or other kind of opportunities on the coasts, for example, Chicago, other kind of larger metropolitan areas. That's been a long-term trend. I think another trend that's going to be increasingly important in the future is as baby boomers pull out of the labor market and retire, how many of them want to stick around, right? Winter came early this year, it turns out, and so perhaps there are people who are going to start to say, you know, maybe in the last years of our retirement, we're going to be in a warmer place, right? I anticipate that that's going to be an increasing trend that we'll see in the state. So if you start to think about kind of young people leaving as well as older people, perhaps migrating out of the state in search of other kind of amenities that they're not finding here, those would be two trends that I would point to.
Hi, my name is Diana Anderson. I'm the CEO of the Southwest Initiative Foundation, and we're a foundation serving the 18 counties of Southwest Minnesota. And I want to add to the conversation that in our region, immigrants are not only contributing in dramatic ways to the labor force, but they're also contributing to the revitalization of our downtowns through their entrepreneurial spirit. And many of the Main Street businesses in Worthington and Wilmer are now immigrant-owned, and so they're contributing, new vitality to streets that previously had been in great decline. So I just want to make sure that we're thinking about that as part of the conversation in terms of what the immigrants are adding to our communities.
Okay, time for one last question, right here in the front.
So I introduced myself earlier, I won't repeat. My question is about what is it that South Dakota and Minnesota, what is it that we should do to help the immigrants actually integrate? So Diana spoke about the downtown areas, et cetera. It seems like often our observation is that they become little islands of immigrants. What can we do from a social policy standpoint to have them truly integrate into the population?
That's a great question. So it is common, and I think understandable, that we see enclaves of immigrants working together. I mean, someone comes, they're successful, they let someone else know about this. I mean, paths to immigration are important ways to lower those costs of migration. So the fact that they tend to group together, I mean, some of those are economic reasons, some are social reasons. I think that's a great thing for the most part. But as far as integrating broader into the economy, into the social fabric, boy, you're asking an economist for a sociological answer. Yeah. Ryan, do you have any thoughts?
Let me give it a try. So I think that, like as Mike said, this has been time immemorial. It's common to see concentrations of co-ethnics or co-nationals in a particular space, that a neighborhood or other aspect of community. And there are a lot of economic as well as social reasons to understand why that's true. It is also true, however, that over time, there are a number of incentives put in place, whether that be seeking a larger house, whether that be looking for a better quality school, whether that be access to other jobs, that those kinds of ethnic enclaves don't survive, right? They change over time. So one example I would give you is the Cedar Riverside neighborhood has long been thought of as the center of the East African community in the state of Minnesota. And in many cases, that's still quite true. There are many Somalis, Eritreans, Ethiopians that live in that neighborhood. But Eden Prairie also has a very large Somali population. Worthington, Wilmer also. So this kind of spatial assimilation, if you will, happens, and it happens for predictable reasons. I think that we can, one of the things that I would urge us to think much more carefully about is how we invest in our educational systems. This is, many people point to this as a cost. That's undoubtedly true. It is also undoubtedly an investment. And if we don't make smart investments today in our K through 12 education in particular, we will reap the results of that in our future labor force, right? So that's an amazing kind of institution that I think that we pay attention to, but not nearly enough.
And we'll have to end there. And Marie, I think that question is very relevant, especially for our final panel, where we have some people coming in to talk about the community level perspective. So remember that question. If you can help me thank our two panelists.